So, we're here to talk about some of the findings from the recent Iris report that we put out, which focused on how marketers perceive brand safety and viewability and challenges that they're experiencing with those technologies. Some of the things that we found in the course of that survey were particularly interesting. For example, we found that 30% of the respondents to that survey said that they experienced actual customer churn as a result of a failure in either their brand safety or viewability partner. So I'm curious what your take is. Like, how bad does a brand safety failure have to be for someone to say, you know what? I'm out of here. I can't possibly work with you in the future. I can't give you my money. Does the average consumer really think that the brand is responsible for the content it happens to have an ad next to? Like, how realistic is that perception? Justin, what do you think?
I think that when people think about it and are rational about it, they can tell themselves, no, it doesn't matter. But the problem here is that we're dealing with very sort of automatic cognitive associative processes. So the moment you see an ad content next to something that is undesirable, particularly in the case of severe brand safety violations, that association is forever sort of locked into your brain. You may be able to rationalize yourself out of it, but somewhere in there is probably a bias that has been triggered by the association. And so brands just don't want any of it as much as possible. They're some of the most savvy people in terms of understanding how to influence people's behavior. That's the whole point of advertising. So they're very, very aware of even subtle impacts like that.
Would you say that that has some influence on why some brands and agencies are more comfortable with certain topics than others and why brand safety can be such a difficult thing to wrap your hands around?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you get away from the concept of a brand safety floor, which is essentially the concept of something that would be considered undesirable by anyone, then you get into the concept of brand suitability, where there is nuance and flexibility about the content. And so, depending on the nature of the brand, its reputation, and its target audience segment, there can be wide variance. So, for example, if you're a condom manufacturer, you're probably not going to be super concerned if your, ad is featured next to a Reddit discussion about, sexual activity. In fact, it's probably related and applicable. Whereas if you are, a laundry detergent brand, you probably want to avoid any sort of adult association because you're targeting more of a family or broader sort of audience group.
That makes sense. Lindsay, what's your take?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Justin was saying. And I think that there's just so much nuance when it comes to this because I think that, you know, there's also the point that like anyone that's, primarily in the media space, we kind of know how advertising works. But if you think about the average consumer who's just looking at, oh, this soda brand that I really enjoy, why is it, it's just the natural association between the brand and the content itself. And they might not truly have the background to understand of how that ad might be placed and all of that. So I think that there's the difference between us that might have like the ad tech background and that of like an average consumer. And so there's that sensitivity that any brand might have about being associated with any content that might inform a brand perception. So I think that's a really key aspect of it overall. And then also just to go off of what Justin was saying is just more so around the nuance of it too. It's just that how you need to be able to have those granular controls to be able to avoid certain types of content based off of the kind of brand that you are, because there's certain criteria that one brand is totally fine with versus for others it's just not okay based off of the specific category that you might be in, and ultimately who you're trying to go after.
Now, I have to ask both of you, knowing that we're kind of on the inside here, so we've got a little bit more familiarity with how all of this works. Have you ever caught yourself making that subconscious association between the content and the ad and then have to think, wait a second, they didn't actually have any control over this?
Well, I would have to say that it wasn't necessarily that I was like, oh, I can't believe, or I necessarily saying that like made that association between the two, but more so I would notice and be like, oh dang, their brand safety controls didn't work in this instance or something along those lines where you realize that there was a failure there. Or even if, whether it be brand safety or other areas, I feel like once you're in the know of something, you kind of have an eye for it and can call it out a little bit more.
I love when I see it kind of the other way around. I'll see an ad module that has been blocked by a brand safety provider, and I look at the content when I see that situation and think, this isn't actually all that objectionable. Maybe I'm just being less sensitive than, the brand safety partner perceives the average consumer to be. But I'm like, why did this get blocked? What was the triggering keyword here that made them think that this shouldn't allow an ad to run next to it?
Yeah, you said actually quite a few very substantive things in that one little bit. So let me break it down a little bit. So when you're talking about like why did it run next to that ad? One of the problems with brand safety and brand suitability as it exists now is that often there isn't really a great deal of transparency into that. So people don't know the answer for why their ad didn't run. The second thing is that in many cases the settings that determine whether it should run might be overly sensitive, right? So maybe something was triggered that shouldn't have been triggered. And then you also mentioned keywords. That's also a fundamental issue. If somebody is targeting based on keywords, which often does happen, then you are going to tend to get over blocking, right? So the whole question that you raise of like, why did that something get blocked there? That's actually one of the major reasons why the entire question of existing brand safety and brand suitability tools has come up as something to investigate and perhaps provide alternatives to, because many people see that. You see like, why did my ad get blocked here? Similarly, there are cases on the other side, like, oops, why did this ad run? Content was clearly something nobody should have seen, and that's been also highlighted in some recent findings by folks in the industry. But all of it sort of has opened the door for the possibility of new approaches that are more transparent, that maybe take into account greater nuance and subtlety so as to avoid overblocking, and that really make things transparent to the user.